Hello, my name's Leon. I'm a psychotherapist and life coach, and today I want to talk about trauma recovery from the lens of somatic experiencing. Somatic experiencing is something that has been created by this really brilliant mind called Peter Levine, who is this really top-notch speaker on matters of trauma. He's really great to listen to, but he could be a bit hard to understand. So I want to put down what he says into simple terms here. So when we undergo trauma, we experience a lot of negative tension that gets built up inside the body. And we go into a negative spiral in our mind, but one that we could feel quite palpably within our nervous system in our body. When this happens, our sense of selfhood, our sense of belonging in this world, our sense of safety, our sense of control gets severely challenged. What's happening is that we're in a fight-flight response. Our brains are in survival mode when we're in this state. Something to keep in mind is trying to find a way to free ourselves from this response. But the solution here is not through merely using the mind, because when we are undergoing a very strong response, we're experiencing it within our body, and our mind goes offline when we're having this response. So the traditional CBT approaches may not be as useful here. It's very useful when it comes to a lot of things, like our sense of when we have our stresses through the day and being able to reframe. It's very useful as part of our daily coping mechanisms toolkit. But when it comes to having a very strong trauma response and having a very strong negative spiral, it may not be if you're using it from the standpoint of using your mind to try to control your inner trauma response. I want to give you the example of martial arts as a metaphor for healing from trauma. When you are fighting in martial arts, by the way, it's not something that I do personally, but when you are fighting, you are put in a state where you might encounter a fight, flight, freeze response, much like you do when you have a trauma response. But martial arts trains you how to respond proactively when that happens. So instead of just merely getting locked into that response, you know how to respond and act, but that takes training, that takes exposure. So you're always put into situations where you might get into a fight, flight, freeze response, but you learn how to respond instead of merely have a negative reaction. So I want to take this metaphor into a more direct metaphor related to mental health. So I'll give you example of an experience I had, a personal one, in which I was going through a traumatic response. And I remember being in a shower, and I just find that my body started shaking with tension. And I was going through these negative thought loops, and my initial instinct is try to push away that shaking and push away those negative thoughts. And of course, that's not going to work. Instead, because it was just happening, I decided to just allow it to happen. So there's some intuition in me that's telling me, I need to do something differently. So I just allowed it to happen, and I observed it happen. I observed what's happening to my body as it was shaking and feeling tension. And then I realized I was actually looking at it with a sense of curiosity instead of judgment. And then I started to shift myself in that through calm breathing and loosening up my body started to slow down, and it started to relax, and my thoughts started to become better. So it's kind of like the martial arts. I was choosing this new response, but something where the response comes from the body. Like in martial arts, you don't think too much about things, just like sports in general or dancing. You don't want to think too much, right? The healing comes from the body. Then I started to just have a sense of curiosity, shift back and forth between the two states. One where I'm shaking and then the thoughts start to show up. And then one where I'm relaxing, I'm slowing down my breath and seeing the difference. And I didn't realize it then, but later when I learned about Peter Levine, I was like, wow, this is what he's been talking about, shifting between these two states, which I'm going to talk about a bit later here. So when it comes to trauma, using a top-down approach is not going to be the most effective. That is using the mind to control what's going on in your body. And what's going on in your body is incredibly overwhelming. Your mind's not going to be that effective. It doesn't mean there's no place for it. There is a place for it. But what's more important is to also consider a bottom-up approach, an approach that starts with the body. When it comes to a trauma response, what's happening is that you have a memory network that is being affected. What I mean by that is that when you get exposed to something that reminds you of your trauma, it accesses the memories of that trauma, and not just in terms of thoughts, but also how you responded to that trauma physiologically. So the memory network includes all the sensations, all what you felt in your body, and also the negative spiraling thoughts. But even those negative spiraling thoughts are going to be automatic spiraling thoughts. The idea of using rational thinking to try to correct is not going to be helpful, because you already know what is the rational thing to think about. But again, when it comes to trauma response, the mind goes offline and you find your body just locked into this multi-sensory response. And it also includes these thoughts. These thoughts are automatic thoughts. These are not thoughts that you control. So if you try to control them by using the mind, it does not make a lot of sense. If you think about it, when it comes to addressing such a situation where you find yourself in a situation that reminds you of your trauma, one of the things that is helpful to do is to do exposure therapy in a controlled way. And when you're doing so, you're not merely changing your thoughts. You're exposing yourself physiologically to that environment and having all those sensations start to be elicited. One thing I would recommend is to really take your time, to really pace yourself, because you don't want to overwhelm your system. So something that's helpful is what I did in the shower, is to notice and observe this reaction happening from a standpoint of curiosity, rather than try to change it right away with rational thinking. And then something that helps keep the edge off is to practice slow breathing that could help loosen and open up the body. So I want to talk about how you could use a bottom-up approach to address having a trauma response. And I find it useful to use personal examples here. I've experienced severe social anxiety, and I believe that social anxiety that I had was a response to having experienced isolation and rejection in the past. And that isolation and rejection got locked into my memory network, so that even when I'm in situations where I'm not being rejected or not being isolated, I couldn't help but interpret that situation as that of isolation, rejection, and getting into that learned helplessness response, that fight and flight response, more like a freeze and flight response that I had in the past when the trauma was initially elicited. Merely trying to change my thoughts about the situation does not work, and also could backfire, because first of all, it's like really invalidating. Second of all, I would know that my thoughts are irrational, and I would just beat myself up and say, how could I have these thoughts? I know they're not rational. I realized that to address the situation, to help me to find a cure for my trauma, I need to approach it from the bottom up. What helped me is to do exposure. But when I do exposure to social situations, to know that I'm going to have this automatic internal trauma response that's going to start to get elicited. In early forms of CBT, what was advocated for is to kind of like throw yourself into the situation, do like a full exposure, and challenge your irrational thoughts using logic. And that's not going to work very well here. That's going to backfire. Instead, I do like little exposure, even expect that I'm going to have these automatic thoughts and have this automatic physiological response internally. Just like what I did with the shower situation, observe this internal response happening with a sense of curiosity and openness and also non judgment. And then later on, I'm able to shift things by shifting my body. I start to do some slow breathing, and it helped to relax and take the edge off the trauma response. Later on, when it comes to CBT, CBT has become more nuanced over time and taken in the idea of doing little exposures, and all that is great. And I think, all of psychotherapy, different fields are really combining together in a very meaningful way to provide very nuanced form of therapy, includes both top-down and bottom-up approaches. So when it comes to social situations, I would expose myself to them, expect those responses that are negative. Remember to take breaks, let my body process the situation. You don't want to overdo things. So Peter Levine gave this really excellent example in that there's these people who meditate really well. Sometimes when they meditate for too long at a time, what happens is that they get into a really blissful state of mind, but then they snap into a trauma response. And that's the same thing with overdoing these adaptive approaches, trying to do them all at once, try to like rationally reconstruct your mind quickly, trying to do too many things at once, even if it's bottom up approaches as well. It takes time for your body to adapt. Yes, your mind can know what is logically true, but it takes time for your body to change and to do the healing when it comes to trauma. So I want to talk about what to do when you have this negative memory network. Again, that's when your body starts to be flooded with this negative response due to trauma, in which your sense of belonging, sense of selfhood starts to disintegrate and you get locked into fight flight. Again, the metaphor of martial arts is going to be very helpful here, but I'm going to apply this with the situation with social anxiety. So I find that through exposure, when I stick to social situations for a longer period of time, I'm helping to retrain my body at a physiological level to learn that it's not in a fight flight situation, fight flight freeze situation, and that I could survive. So the longer I stick with it and I see, I survived the situation, I'm teaching my body at an unconscious physiological level, I'm okay. I'm okay. And I'm also introducing new memories. So I start to find that people are not responding as negatively as I think. And I have these positive interactions and they become part of my memory network. So when I have that traumatic response, yes, I have these negative thoughts about rejection and isolation, but I'm also starting to take in these new responses of, okay, I'm surviving despite this being in a social situation. I have these positive responses. And this is not merely at an intellectual level, it's from an experiential level that I'm teaching my body. And then this is how the memory network starts to evolve over time and rewiring it to have more of a positive response. But it's not going to just snap away the negative responses overnight. They could coexist in the same space, but slowly the positive is growing more and more. You have to allow your body to adapt and adjust over time. You can't flip it like a switch using logic and a rationale. Your mind could already be there in terms of what logically, rationally makes sense. Of course, these people are not rejecting or isolating me, but it takes some time for your body to adjust to it. So I don't want to overdo the exposure, because then I'll snap myself back into the traumatic response. I do a little exposure at a time. I remember to take a break, take a breather, do slow breaths to take the edge off the traumatic response and allow my body to do the healing. And I don't want to overdo the corrective response either, because that could also snap me into the traumatic response. So you kind of go a bit into one and a bit into the other, and then back. And this is Levine's process as he describes it. Now, if you like this video, I believe that you'll really benefit from this article I've written called Overcoming an Anxiety Attack Due to Internal Conflict. If you experience internal conflict within yourself, you feel like one side of yourself says one thing, another says the opposite, and an anxiety attack develops from that. This is about what you could do about that kind of situation. If you like this channel and this content, to support me, what you could do is you click like and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching.